All very much for joining this morning. We're starting a little late because everything's running a little bit late, so thank you for your patience as well. I think many of us have been running outside, so it's good to take a breath anyway. So this session this morning is a workshop on equity interventions that have been tested and proven to be effective in different parts of the world, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this. I'm just going to tell you a bit about the objective of this session so that we're all kind of in the same place on this, and we are going to be sharing equity promotion initiatives at the institutional level in various parts of the world, including Brazil, Chile, India, in their support for African students, and also interventions to integrate refugee students into the higher education systems of their host countries. So this is just to help you frame what we're doing today. My name is Roberta Basse. I'm the global lead for tertiary education at the World Bank, and I'll be moderating this elaborate and professional, wonderful panel of experts that have joined us today. So I'm going to start, and I'm just going to ask each of you to just introduce yourselves and speak where you're coming from so we don't waste time on a long bio. We've kind of, I think all of us are a little bioed out today at this point. So I'm going to turn it over to Renato. Renato, please, is going to speak about his experiences supporting equity interventions in Brazil. Over to you, Renato.
Okay. My name is Renato Pedrosa. I'm retired now from the faculty at Unicamp, in the State University of Campinas, which is in the state of São Paulo. And I started in mathematics, and then I moved to higher education when the president of the university invited me to run the admissions office 20 years ago. So at that time, so that's my bio. Okay, so at that time, I'll start afterwards. What happened 20 years ago? So yeah, move.
No, you can start with your presentation, then we'll move on to video after yours. Yes.
Okay,
yeah, exactly.
So 20 years ago in Brazil, the Brazilian president, Fernando Cardoso, he supported the Durban Declaration on Racial Equality. That was a meeting in Durban, South Africa. And because of that, it started lots of initiatives in Brazil at all levels, in particular in higher education, to improve the chances of people, black people. Brazil had a long time with this slavery system. I think it was the last country in Latin America to abolish slavery. And with a large black population, about half of the population in recent times. And they were not visible in the universities, especially in the elite institutions, the publics that were funded with tax money. And so there were quite a few initiatives. It started in Rio de Janeiro. The state legislature approved the law that the state university there should have a quota for blacks. The University of Brasilia, the capital, started a program. And in the state of São Paulo, there was a law that was proposed to start a quota system in the public state universities, of which Unicamp is one of the three members. And the president of the university asked the admissions office, what can we say about this? Can we say anything that is academically relevant, or just let it go? And we developed a study that showed that students coming from public schools, high schools, with a usually lower socioeconomic level compared to those coming from private schools, if you compare to their level in entrance examination results, when they graduated, they had advanced quite significantly. This has been published in the OECD journal, and it had a major impact in Brazil. And we use that as to use it backwards. So how many points should we give the students from public schools to compensate for that, so that actually we are doing a better measure of their potential as students? So we developed this first affirmative action program. Was not a quota, was just a bonus point system for public school graduates, and with an extra points for blacks within that group. So you had both a socioeconomic aspect and a racial aspect. 4 years later, we realized that despite it having had some effects, if you look at the population that was coming in, was still an elite group, in the sense that most of the parents had gone to college, even though, so it was the elite of the public high schools. And then we did what I think we are trying to do here, is learn from other experiences. So we went to the US. The US has long history of affirmative action, and Texas at that time had instituted the 10% program, where 10% of students of each high school should be admitted to the Texas system, and they had, because they had done a study, and since the inception of the system, over 70 schools had never had a student in the Texas system. And obviously, when you look at that, it was the schools in the indigenous areas, in the poor areas, in the Latino areas, and so on. So, and they did this. So, and we look at Campinas. So we had 96 high schools. Of those, 56 had never had a student in Unicamp. 56, over 60% of the schools in the city of Campinas had never had a student admitted to Unicamp. So what we did, yes, let's do the same thing or similar. We take a few students from every high school. But we had this national exam, and we could look at their grades, and it was clear that at least 1/3 of those students that we admitted through that system would have a lot of difficulties, because we knew from the general admission system that if you were below a certain level, your chance of being successful was very low, especially in engineering and the hard sciences, or mathematics. And so we thought and said, no, let's do this. Let's start it as a general education college for 2 years. It's not, they don't just get into the system like the students coming from the other affirmative action program. They need some help. And we did that, and moreover, the program had a general education interdisciplinary character, so that they would be exposed to all areas of the higher education. And this was very interesting. In 2011, when the first time we had the first class, I gave a talk to this 100+ students in an auditorium. And the first thing my job was to tell them about the various programs, the various areas that they could go forward after 2 years to study. And I asked them, who here want to do engineering? 1/3 of the students raised their hand. Who here want to go to medical school? Another 1/3 of them. Who want to go to teaching? Nobody. They were smart. They were smart. But they were smart because they know what's so you shouldn't underestimate people know about higher education, even if they are coming from a poor background, especially if they're so computer science, a lot of them. Then I said, well, there are many other areas here that we probably never heard about. Statistics, pretty hard course, but very good for a career later. Or agricultural engineering. Nobody heard that there is, they knew about electrical engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, but agricultural engineers, nobody knew about that. So I started talking in other areas. So after the talk, I asked again, and a lot of people, how many don't know? Then there was a larger group, maybe I don't know now. And after 2 years, you see that they spread it around the whole, all types of programs. And one thing that I think was very important was to convince the faculties, the schools, to admit those students afterwards. And medical education at Unicamp the regular admission system is 200 students per spot, per place. 200 is 0.5% admission rate of applicants. Yes. It's incredibly complicated for a student to be admitted in, and they offered 10% more places for this program. So in that program, the rate is 3 to 1, which means if the student comes through that system, he has a much better chance to be admitted to medical school than if they go through the regular system. So now, is it effective for social inclusion? 50+% of the students in the regular system have parents that have gone to college. In this class, 15%. In the regular class at that time, 12 to 15% were black. In this group, 38% were black. So we didn't have any criteria involved. Criteria regarding race or socioeconomic status, or anything. It's just geographic inequality in a big urban area. Okay, so what about the results? The results are pretty good, actually. About 70%, 65–70% progress to their courses, and then they graduate at the same rate as everybody else. So it's in this sense. What's not, well, there's another aspect that I think it's better than any other system. Unicamp actually has now a quota system, an exam dedicated to indigenous people. And actually, this is interesting because São Paulo doesn't have a lot of indigenous people anymore. And so 80% of those that go admitted through the indigenous exam, they come from other states, especially from the central western states in Brazil, where there are lots of indigenous people still. So we have 2.6% of the student population is indigenous now, and in the States is like 0.2% of the population. So you see how Unicamp has, but this has one big advantage over the other programs, is these students go back to their community and tell the other students to come in. That they have a chance. And let me finish by telling this story. When I was there at the admissions office, we would call the principals of the various high schools in Campinas that we wanted to go there and give a talk about Unicamp. And the response of many of them is, don't waste your time. No student from my high school will ever get into Unicamp. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm just going to highlight two aspects of what you said before we hand over to Vidya. And the first is the Texas program on which Unicamp modeled this admission initiative purposefully and with attention to the realities in Campinas was actually forced upon the University of Texas environment by anti-affirmative action findings by the Supreme Court. So Texas did not voluntarily, as Campinas did, the policy environment didn't seek affirmative action interventions, but the institutions did, and they wanted to find a way to maintain this social outreach to the underserved.
I think it was the Texas Supreme Court.
Yes, and then
not the national, the Supreme, but
yes,
yes,
because California did it as well.
Yeah,
but both in response to
there was pressure.
They were fighting. So I applaud the effort at Campinas, because universities do have a really strong role to play in social progress, even if society is not embracing it in the same way. And then the second point was your last point, which is that when you track your students and you have communication campaigns that reach out to them as early as possible, right, you change the minds not just of the students but of the schools and of their teachers of what the opportunities exist. And so we need to encourage that in the youngest populations and continuing on through their education pipeline. So over to you, Dr. Vidya. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I think the university that I represent in India, the Symbiosis International University, is like a case study for equity promotion. So 50 years ago, there was a professor of botany in one of the oldest colleges in the city of Pune, which is close to Mumbai. And he was also the warden of the boys' hostel. And one day during vacation time, when all the Indian students had gone back home, he saw that there used to be a girl who would come to the window of the boys' hostel and pass something through the window. And so as a strict warden, he went to scold this boy because in India it was then a very orthodox society, and you wouldn't see girls hanging around, closer to boys' hostels. And he went inside, and he wanted to really shout at this boy. What he saw was an African boy who was sleeping on the bed, and he, when Dr. Muzumdar, the teacher, asked him, who's this girl who comes and what does she give you through the window? He said that she's my sister who comes and gives me home-cooked food because I'm suffering from jaundice. There's nobody to take care of me. All the Indian students have gone back to their homes because it is vacation time, and I cannot afford to go back. I have come here on an ICCR scholarship. The Indian government provides scholarships to African students. He was actually from Mauritius, and he said he started weeping profusely, and he said, I have no one to take care of me. And I think that incident changed the mind of the professor, and he started interviewing foreign students who came to the city even then. India is known to attract a large number of foreign students since centuries. And then, of course, there was a lull, and then again it started post-independence. And therefore, in the city of Pune, which is known as the Oxford of the East, it's a very highly, high-intense academic city. There were a lot of foreign students, but they came from Afro-Asian backgrounds, primarily from Africa, few parts of Asia and West Asia, Southeast Asia and West Asia. So the African students faced a lot of problems. So what the professor did was to interview these students and actually publish their interviews in the local newspaper, so as to sensitize the community towards telling them that these are the students who would get educated in India, and they need to get good experiences so that when they go back to their home countries, when they assume good positions in their home countries, they should carry goodwill about the country, about the city, and not really ill will. Because the stories that then the African students told that if I am sitting in a bus, traveling in a bus, if a seat next to me is vacant, no Indian would want to come and sit next to me because I'm black. Another story an African student would say is that when I get up in the morning and go to the washroom, in India, the hostel rooms would have common washrooms. And so if I go to the washroom and I'm walking across the rooms, people would close their windows because they don't want to see a black face in the morning because it's not considered a good omen. So these were horrendous stories that were published, and so as to sensitize the citizens of the city to telling them that these are like, our own students and we need to take care of them. And of course, but that wasn't enough, and therefore, the idea was to bring Indian and foreign students together on a common platform, and that's how the university that I represent, Symbiosis, again, it's a botanical word, meaning two different organisms coming together for mutual benefit. That was established 50 years ago when nobody ever thought of internationalization, thought of foreign students or anything. And so then we started tracking what these African students really do. So they are very happy. They were very happy with the education system in India. They were very happy with because it was affordable. It wasn't very expensive, but they were not really happy with the experiences in India. And therefore, they would go back and carry these experiences, bad experiences, than really the good ones. And therefore, to transform these bad experiences into good ones, Symbiosis as an organization did a lot for foreign students and is continuing doing that for the last 50 years. And we've been tracking students, and surprisingly, when these interviews were taken, I'm talking about 1970, 1971, when these interviews were taken and were published in a book, in the form of a book, later when I started handling internationalization at the university, in 2014, I interviewed a few more African students, and the responses were the same. So nothing had changed really. So the perception of people, the perception of the community hadn't really changed, and it continued. So I think it's going to be a continuous effort to sensitize the community to believing that, people from different parts of the world, no matter which skin color they come from, which religion they come from, which backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds they come from, we must believe that the world is one family and they are like us. So that's been the objective for the last 50 years. But I'm happy to inform that though they carried this not so good impressions about the city, because of the good education that they got in India, they are at very good positions. In fact, many of them, some of them even working for UNESCO. I still remember a student from South Sudan who was so poor, and a total freeship, a scholarship was offered to him, and now he's working with the UNESCO in Kuwait. So there are very successful examples. As a university, we have a lot of engagement with international students, not just admitting them in our university, but actually engaging with students from foreign students from other universities as well, from the city. What we've done is, I think one of the biggest challenge was how to assimilate them in the mainstream, and so we started something called as a buddy system, where an Indian student is attached to a foreign student so closely that they develop strong bonds, and whether the students feel homesick or they want to know the Indian culture, or they have learning problems or whatever, that's been taken care of by the student buddy first. Then there is a faculty that is assigned in every institution under the university, in every department, to take care of foreign students, so that in case these students feel the learning issues or whatever, those are taken care of. And then of course a strong international office at the university level which does. Apart from all this, the administration part, there are proactively, we do a lot of things to bring Indian and foreign students together, celebrating national days of student of countries, arranging cultural programs of international students on a common platform, again to showcase their culture, because we believe that culture plays a major role in again bringing people together. Arranging international food festivals, so so that the students feel happy about showcasing their culture, their food, their cuisine to Indian students. So a lot of such activities are also done, and most importantly, we understand that many of these students who come from Africa specifically cannot even afford Indian education. They really come from poor backgrounds, and therefore there are dedicated scholarship programs which offer from a full scholarship to a part scholarship, and students can apply and get those scholarships. And I'm very happy to inform there are hundreds of students who have been educated through the scholarship program. And what has happened is, because the university started offering such scholarships, the Indian government partnered with the university, then the governments of those home countries also gave scholarships. So how it happens, you do something, there is a ripple effect, and there are many others who also want to do something more. So that's been the story for the last 50 years. And so we have a dedicated program called Engage Africa. Of course, we do with other countries as well, but I'm just concentrating on Africa because I was asked to speak about them. And therefore, this whole Engage Africa program is on offering scholarships, giving them good experiences, giving them professional education, and again, surprising, but I would go with him that African students coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds also have choices. So they wouldn't want to join a general arts or commerce program, but they would want to do a professional program, either a nursing, a medicine, or engineering, because they know these are the skills that will help them to get better jobs. The other part which we are still working on is that while these students come on scholarship and go back and become successful and start earning, not many have recommended scholarships for others. So that's something that we are working on, that if I got a scholarship and I have started earning, can I recommend a student, or can I pay for some part of the tuition fee for someone else who's as unfortunate as I am, as I was. But that change of mindset we haven't seen, but we're working on that. So this is I can take some more questions from you later.
Sure. Perfect. Thank you so much. That was excellent. I again will highlight just a couple of points that I found really resonant for me. One is that it's not enough to have the intention, right? You saw intent, very purposeful in the 70s. You saw again 50 years later, 40 years later, the problem persists. So intention's not enough. It takes committed actions and committed transformative actions. So changing them over time when you see that they don't work. So this is where you are now, and I think that's very powerful. I think as well, both Renato and Vidya talked a lot about needing to track their students, and tracer studies, and the impact of knowing what happens to them, not just to have an idea of how to improve the experience of current students, but also to explain to future students what their opportunities could be, because this information is data rich and realistic. And so those 2 points I'd like to highlight from here. I'm going to turn this over to Carla. Thank you so much. Carla is going to present in Spanish, so if you don't have translation and you need it, please do get it. Over to you on the experiences in Chile. Thanks.
Bueno, hola a todos y
Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Moreno. I'm from Chile, and I work in an inclusive access program at the University of Santiago, and I'm also deputy director of the higher education chair, UNESCO chair. I've been working in different programs there, and over the last year, we've worked on a foundation called the International Center CINESU for Inclusion in Higher Education. And I would like to acknowledge Professor Gil here, who encouraged many of us and enchanted us almost by showing us how we could contribute to inclusion. In this presentation, I wanted to highlight challenges and what we've learned through this experience in building different programs. And the different conversations rather that we had with Professor Gil, we said that programs should analyze context in 3 ways: by seeing, by judging, and acting. And why seeing? Well, we have to examine the context and see why and how certain sectors in society found it nearly impossible to access us. In Chile, we have a relatively unequal society, and for a long time, there was a significant group of students from a given social class. They were measured by standardized university access tests, and certain students weren't able to access because they didn't get the marks they needed on that test. And we lost some talent that way, year in and year out. After having seen this, then we decided to move on to the next step, which is judging. How can we overcome barriers, reduce the barriers, and not just say, well, it's the students who don't have the marks, aren't able to access, they're just not up to it. There's something that's up to us, perhaps, and we can contribute. And then finally, act, the third point. What can we do differently? And that's where we generated different programs. Of all of the different programs that we generated, I'm going to cite 2 as examples over the last 30 years. This program is very similar to what we heard from the professor from Brazil. We also pulled from the University of Texas experience. In 2007, Professor Máximo González was actually one of the drivers of this policy. And this policy stems from certain academicians at the University of Santiago de Chile, and it began to be replicated elsewhere. 16 universities around Chile had this program. And what did it consist of? Well, they took students that were in their last year of secondary school, and they had them participate for 16 weeks in the university, very rigorous programs with math, language, and personal management to eliminate the standardized test barrier and have them able to access the university if they could pass this period. In Chile, in 2014, under the second term of Michelle Bachelet, we had an inclusive access program to higher education, and it was the government that took this policy on as a general public policy. So it was no longer just 16 universities that was doing this. It was now 29 universities. There was public funding for this. And it wasn't just the limitations that these institutions might have had on a one-on-one basis, but there was joint work with more than 581 teaching establishments. And there is one of these so-called Basse schools, and this helped 97,000 students. And so between the third and fourth years of secondary school or high school, and so we did prospecting or vocational prospecting, and many students are first generations. In other words, their educational levels in the household weren't very high. So the earlier we caught, so to speak, those students and saw the range of technical and university paths they could pursue, then we were able to work with this talent better. Secondly, another very important characteristic was not only accessing the university, but remaining. We have the standardized tests barrier, but then once people are in, they need to stay in. And so in the second year of University of Studies, we worked on two different lines of actions. One was where we have engineering students have tutors, another student farther ahead of them in their studies in chemistry, physics, maths, and then we had the socio-educational dimension where we tackled managing time, for instance, because the university is very different. It has different codes than secondary school does. So the more we prepare and provide tools, the better. So how did we work with them through tutoring, ongoing monitoring, and following the students? We needed to see whether they had any financial difficulties and how they were able to function in the city. These students come from establishments with the highest exclusion rate and vulnerability rate. So one of the things that was very important was to see how the different players were able to build on each other. We had Professor Maximo Gonzalez, as I mentioned before. Then we had someone else come on board, which was the government of Chile, that backed these access policies. And in addition, we also had civil society through foundations and other institutions that supported this. And then, of course, and I think that this is what is most important, was working with the learning institutions themselves. The better the relationship, the more effective. Roberta also mentioned this. We are broadening out expectations. Many of these students, well, we just refuse to believe that there's no student in Chile that isn't able to access university education or higher learning. And in the newspapers, we could see that there were people who came from the elite who studied at universities. And so then we got back to the seeing, judging, and acting steps. There wasn't a single student who had the talent to access university other than these people. We had to ask ourselves. And so I think that working on an early basis, as we did, helped us worked to see that parents looking at their students, well, they said, why are you coming here to recruit? Nobody's going to get into the university. And this is a program that's present at Chile's most prestigious universities. So they might go to the Universidad Católica, Universidad Austral, Universidad de Concepción. So the learning institutions might also impact the students. The more we work as a system or a network, the better, because we feel that we're not inventing the wheel, we're pooling from each other's experience. When we take a look at the actual situation, the different institutions are as different as their different contexts are. And so if we have 20% of migrant or indigenous or disabled populations, well, they can't simply be neglected. We have to do things differently. Our best idea was always to implement pilot projects that could be replicated. Later on in the conversation, we can mention this. Lastly, we need to act because generations are coming one after another, and we're supporting things a lot. We'd even like to work as early as preschool. Now, a person can spend 15 years in schooling. That isn't the best, but we can do something today to enable effective access for these students. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. I'm finding this conversation extremely rewarding. It's like the most important things that we do in higher education are all here on the stage, and it's very exciting for me right now. So I'm going to highlight just two things that Carla said, although you can hear the themes emerging across all three so far. I'm sure we'll hear similar from Manal as well. But the first, and something that is actually quite near and dear to my heart, is this idea that university entrance exams are not fair, and they don't represent merit in the way that systems think they do and they have historically thought they do, and that a purposeful attention to that challenge and coming in and challenging that as a norm can be transformative. And so what you did was to really push back on something that was such historically accepted artificial equity, right? So I think that's great. And then the second point was this focus on access and progression. And we talk more and more about this globally. It's not enough to get them into the classroom. They need to be finishing, and they need to be finishing in a way that gives them a real potential for a future that's meaningful for them. So it's a much longer process than just getting them into the institution, which does require human and financial resources. And that's a challenge. What you described, because your government bought into it and your civil society bought into it, you had resources to help you with that, but not every society does, and we need to think creatively about that as well. Thank you so much. That was really illuminating. Over to you, Manal. Thank you so much for being here to talk about the work that UNHCR is doing to expand tertiary education for refugee communities. Over to you.
Thanks, Roberta, and thanks to Jamil and the other organizers for inviting UNHCR to be a part of this. I'll start. I just wanted to acknowledge what the other panelists have presented in terms of really specific interventions and programs and approaches, by way of saying that from UNHCR, I'm going to talk about our scholarship program, but we are really coming from a, sort of a bird's eye global perspective, where we have our scholarship program is operating in 55 countries and serving a very limited number of young people with respect to what the actual demand is amongst displaced youth. So let me begin with a few numbers, and I hope that it's helpful rather than overwhelming. So in the world today, I mean, we've got more than 20 million displaced people, and amongst them are roughly 3 million young people of university-going age. Our scholarship program is designed to help people attend university in the countries where they are displaced. So there are many different opportunities for young people to move abroad and attend university, but what our program does is tries to address access barriers in first countries of asylum. And they are many. But we can't talk about inclusion of refugee youth in higher education without talking about the host communities that they live in. Because over 80% of displaced people are located in low to middle income countries where access barriers to higher education are immense for everyone. So in that respect, I also note that the subtitle of this event or this panel is about what works. And what I can say about that is that we are very much still in a learning process. So our scholarship program has been running for 30 years, and we are very, very much, I can say, still learning what works and what does not work. So what the program is attempting to do is overcome barriers, first and foremost, with respect to finance. So in terms of displaced populations, access to livelihood and sufficient finance to fund higher education is very rare, often non-existent. And so first and foremost, again, the scholarship program provides tuition and a living allowance for young people to attend university. It's contextualized in a shift, in a global shift. So when initially humanitarian response was focused very much on a temporary solution, right? People would cross the border. The idea was that they would be displaced for several months or several years and then return home. What we know after several decades is that the vast majority of forcibly displaced people are in displacement for multiple cycles of their education. So it's only in recent times that this need for higher education for refugee youth has become a priority, quite frankly. So as I said, the scholarship program is 30 years old, but in the past 7 years, it tripled in size. Mm-hmm. So it's only with, again, this process of ongoing learning that higher education is less of an afterthought today than it was 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. So for example, Maki, our colleague Maki from UNESCO, last night recognized that 10 years ago at the second World Higher Education Conference, there was no mention of refugees. Mm-mm. There was no conceptualization that this has to be part of humanitarian response. Today, we're in a very, very different place. And the most recent mass displacement situations, including from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Ukraine, et cetera, have really underscored that, where you have large numbers of young people coming out of their countries with very firm expectations and demands that they be allowed to continue their education when in displacement. So in terms of that shift away from humanitarian response being a very temporary activity, UNHCR's position today is grounded in the concept of inclusion. So social inclusion, financial inclusion, political inclusion, et cetera. So our expectation and our request of host governments, et cetera, is that displaced populations, rather than being provided specialized services, right? All the typical things, a tent, food parcels, separate schools for refugees located in refugee camps, separate healthcare facilities, et cetera. The expectation now is that we are moving to a situation where refugees are included whole scale in the communities that are hosting them. And of course, with that is an immense expectation of the ability of that host country to provide for them. And as you can see, I don't think that we can qualify this as something that works yet, because it's in direct conflict, that we've got massive numbers of people with immense needs moving into countries that are largely under-resourced themselves, right? So these, we haven't figured out how to work on this. And I think that this is something that Roberta's agency, of course, is deeply, deeply involved in. You know, we just did a massive global costing of refugee education. And that was specifically in order to be able to support host governments to understand what does it mean to prepare for and then to address the needs of a huge influx of people that want access to all of your national systems that are already under pressure. And so, I mean, again, I don't have very much positive to say about where we are, except that, as you've seen from the young people who've joined us here at the workshop, so all of the refugee student delegation, is that despite all of these pushes and pulls and conflicts and you know, difficult circumstances that we're working in, they continue, as you've all said, to succeed. And we could say the same thing about recruiting in refugee camps. You know, people would say, who in a refugee camp is going to qualify for going to university? Well, as it turns out, many young people are qualified and do indeed succeed when they get to university in a situation of displacement. So in terms of, let me talk a little bit about the way the scholarship specifically attempts to address barriers. So first is the legal issue. So on one side, and I'm recognizing my colleague Michaela, who recently authored a paper that looks at these barriers and cites case studies of what is working, what are some good practices for overcoming these barriers. So on one side, we've got countries where refugees are prohibited from attending higher education. So there we've got to deal with the legal barrier. These are the toughest situations. Then another quasi-legal issue is movement. So oftentimes where refugees are located in very marginalized, most disadvantaged communities, in order to access higher education in urban centers, they have to have the right to move. They have to have freedom of movement. In some cases they do, in some cases they don't. And so there we have to have a regulatory or a legal response to that barrier. In context where refugees do have freedom of movement, you see many times they're moving to urban centers in order to access higher education there. Our scholarship program does not confine anyone to any certain institution or any certain type of educational institution. So they do have, of course, they do have that freedom to choose what is best suited to their context and the barriers that they're facing. As I said, finance is core, and I think that one of the main concerns of the young people is that in order to focus on their studies, removing some, probably not all, but some of that financial pressure is core, so that they are not forced to be working and studying and, you know, cobbling together bits and pieces of all of these to put the puzzle together so that they can remain at university. The truth of the matter is that many of them are, you know, working, providing for their families, and studying on the side, you know, facing oftentimes lack of electricity. Many times, lack of a laptop. I mean, these young people are going through university with no computer, to be quite honest. And that, I feel like, in terms of our scholarship, that's one of the things that doesn't work. And we are adapting and we have to adapt, but we are definitely behind the times in that respect. And then I think that the one other piece that we're learning so much about is then the actual inclusion. So once these young people overcome all of these different barriers and arrive on campus, what we hear from them is that process of getting integrated is not an easy one. And I think you all have highlighted that they're oftentimes, you know, students themselves, so non-refugee students themselves, are the best conduit for young people to become effectively included and integrated into the university system, so that they can benefit from all of the activities and services and extracurriculars and everything that other students are participating in. So then I guess I'll just try to wrap up here with a combination of what is working and what's not working in terms of the specifics. So one thing that's not working so far is achieving gender equity. So at this moment, we've got 40% female participation in our program. And we have obviously an institutional commitment to equity. We have to get to 50%. And it's not a question of young women not being qualified, but it is, I mean, those who apply, but it is a question of insufficient number of girls graduating from secondary school. Mm-hmm. So refugee access to secondary school and completion and retention, this is our biggest challenge. Once those girls girls get through, they are absolutely far and away qualified, and indeed are choosing those kinds of degree programs that are putting them on a pathway to very, very high impact and high quality employment. The other thing that I think is probably not working very well is including displaced people who are living with disability. Mm-hmm. These are some of the most marginalized people in the world. And we're finding it very difficult to access those young people to ensure that they are getting through secondary school and aware of this opportunity to apply for a scholarship to go to higher education. So we have some real shining stars of universities, for example, in Kenya, that are actively supporting disabled refugee youth to get into higher education and complete. So that's something that we definitely need to work on. The other piece I would say is gender nonconforming students is also a difficulty in refugee population, getting these young people into a higher education, because they are so often invisible. Mm-hmm. Having already been in a situation of fleeing persecution, whether related to the gender aspect or not, gender non-conforming displaced people, again, are highly invisible population, often concealing themselves and difficult to reach for that respect. And so, we again rely on student groups and rely on the activism and the outreach that students themselves can do to reach these very, very hard to identify populations. The last thing I guess that I would say is that we recently completed the first ever independent evaluation of our scholarship program. So in 3 decades, we've never taken a scientific look at our program, probably because we're just always trying to keep up. But now we've had an evaluation, and one of the things that I want to highlight with respect to gender is one of the most interesting findings to me is that what we know now is that the existence of the scholarship program, the fact that young people know it exists, is having a positive impact on girls completing secondary education. So I can tell we're on the right track. As I said, we're still only at 40% female enrollment in our scholarship program. But if we can get more girls completing secondary ed, we will have more girls applying for, or more young women applying for our scholarship program. And then the last thing I think is, for sure, at least in refugee response, the question is sustainability, replicability, and scalability. Mm-hmm. And I will say in full transparency that a standalone bespoke scholarship program like this is not the way that we are going to get every single displaced young person into university. It's expensive. As I said, we're in 55 countries and we only reach 7,500, 8,000 students per year. This is nothing. And we can't expect that we're going to be able to scale a scholarship program. So again, I come back to this point about inclusion and this immense ask that we are making of the host countries to figure out how are we going to equally include refugees in the education systems that exist and that are already under immense pressure. This is the ask. It's a hard one, but this is the truth. This is where we're at. So I think it's unfortunate that we end, after all of these positive, wonderful examples, that I'm sort of putting out an untenable challenge. But that is where we are, and I think maybe the most positive thing I can say is that, again, if you have a chance to speak to any of the refugee delegates who are here, they have incredible stories. They're incredible, successfully and inspired group of young people, and so I think for that reason, it's worth doing what we're doing. It's worth this small, drop in the ocean, because hopefully that is, in terms of replicability, hopefully that provides an example and an inspiration for other ways that we can cobble together our scarce resources to make higher education available for more displaced youth. But I think all of you, I thank you for including us, of course, Roberta, and all of the panelists who, in these countries, I'm familiar with the working environment in all of these countries, and they are incredibly inclusive. And so I would take any of those as an example for what we're headed for. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Manal. Yes, I think to all of you. Actually, I find, the issues of improving the student experience in refugee communities, displaced communities, really low-income environments can seem quite bleak. You're telling a very realistic story, but there are people from UNHCR, people from the institutions and societies who also see these environments and are playing a really important role in making a difference. And so even in the days where it feels a little bit more, right? Because we all have those days, the progress is steady and it's moving in the right direction. So it may not go as fast as we wish, but it's definitely heading in the right direction. Some of the points that I think I would highlight from you is a point I wrote down while you were speaking, which is visibility in itself is progress. And what you talked about when you're bringing them into these communities, by integrating them into the school districts, by making them part of the communities, you're creating visibility of the human experience. And what happens with refugees so often is when you take them and put them aside, they're not human, they're not visible, there's no progress. So again, these little steps make a big difference in humanizing those who are different to become more of your neighbor. And this is a really important part of what you do through UNHCR's work on the campuses and in supporting integration in schools and communities. I'm going to stop here with the panel because we now have about a half an hour. This is a workshop. It's meant to be interactive, so we'd like to field questions from the audience. I, of course, could ask 100 questions of these brilliant people, but I'm not going to. I'm going to really encourage you all to grab the mic and ask some questions. So, and I know some people in the audience that I will call on you if nobody offers. So. No pressure, but there was a little pressure. So somebody ask a question. There we go. Someone get it going. Very good.
Hi, congratulations on this really exciting panel. My name is Andrea Detmer, and I'm working for UNESCO. Yesterday in a panel about data, we discussed about the importance of having more specific indicators about vulnerable students, people in general, and perhaps even specific indicators, to follow on the specific intersectional discriminations that you just mentioned. And in this panel, you have mentioned, among many other interesting things, about the increased funding that support for vulnerable potential students is needed. And I wonder if it might be possible, perhaps it exists and I'm just not aware of, but to have some indicators about, like, if you have this sort of standard student on a kind of standard, let's say, perhaps privileged standard, let's say, student, and that costs 100. I mean, I'm being very bold and cold in the figures, but just to mention what I'm imagining in terms of indicators, then could we say, okay, a refugee, on average, I'm not, talking big numbers, how much would that cost? Is it 115, 150? And then if it's a displaced person or refugee and it's a woman and it has some disability, is it 200? Is it 500? And I think if we are able to kind of measure with indicators, okay, we have this number of students with this sort of disadvantaged situation, and this is the cost. And this is the cost if they are if they have more than one disadvantage. How much does it cost for each government, and therefore organizations like the World Bank perhaps can also kind of grasp better, what it means in tangible terms? Because I see that there are so fantastic experiences and good practices, but as you say, the scalability of this, if it's like one scholarship or one institution, of course you can scale as a network, Camila, no, was saying, well, anyway. Just to say that I think it might be interesting to monetize and, to put into numbers what this means. Also to be able to raise more money, actually, in easier ways.
Correct, yeah. Very good.
So if you know that this exists, I would be happy to hear about the sources, please. Thank you.
I would like to know that too. So yeah, please go ahead. Sure. Yeah. Why don't we take a couple? If there's no more hands, and then we'll go to this one, and then hopefully you'll think of questions. So Jamil, you're going to ask a question. Go ahead.
Jamil, Salmi, thank you very much for these great presentations. And building on Andrea's question, I think which is important is how do you make the good programs visible, the good initiatives visible? We all criticize the rankings, and yet many people are paying attention to the ranking. And I was coming up with this idea after we had a session with the Lumina Foundation, and they explained to us how they made a survey back in 2009 in the US, and they realized that there was only one state out of 50 that had official policy goals to improve attainment. And so, using a little bit this notion of telling and shaming, they set up in a website where they put data from the various states, and they engage with the states. To cut a long story short, 15 years later, we have 40 states out of 50 that have made official commitments. And I've been thinking over the past years that it would be good not to shame, but to highlight, to have, in the same way Times Higher Education, I think very cleverly, has moved to this impact ranking. And I would say that it's the least bad of the rankings, if you allow me, because it has those universities that participate have been forced to ask questions about themselves. What are they doing? And sometimes they realize they're doing much more towards the SDGs than they think. So perhaps we could think collectively on ways to highlight, not only for refugees, but for various groups, and looking at this issue of intersectionality that has come out in this conference. I think it is so important as a way of pushing for this agenda of inclusion and pluralism in our universities.
Thanks, Jamil. Okay, over to the panel. So who would like to start? Oh, video will start first, okay. Once you start talking, it'll click on. Yeah.
So just to give an example of the university that, this is a private university where I come from, and money matters obviously because there's no government funding. But the intention of helping African students and other Afro-Asian students was there right from the establishment. So as Jamil said very rightly, that you start doing little work. I mean, you can't quantify. If I have to quantify, the Indian government allows only 20% students as foreign students in an institution, which is over and above the the Indian students' intake. So it doesn't really eat up the fees of or it's not that the Indian students would be charged more, because these are over and above the sanctioned intake by the government. I think with the intention of even providing 10% international students through a full scholarship program, others look at it and then, there is an effect. I mean, 50 years ago, there was just one institution which was Symbiosis doing it. Today, if you see, there are at least 25 institutions in India that would be providing some kind of scholarship. May not be as much as what Symbiosis provides, but definitely. So I think the cascading effect of a good intent of doing something, really not looking at the economics so much, but then the after effects of how it's going to affect the community that you're catering to, and how others also start coming, start building on it and start providing the same scholarship, because they know that if one institution is doing some good work, probably they also can. And while even I don't like rankings, as Jamil said, but the Times Higher Education rankings with the impact rankings, all this also counts. So probably more number of institutions are then doing some kind of proactive inclusivity work, which they wouldn't have otherwise, just to get into that accreditation and ranking, bandwagon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay. Go ahead, Renato. Go ahead, yes.
Well, the cost of undergraduate student at Unicamp is about $10,000 in purchase parity. 10,000, okay, in purchase parity power. So when Unicamp start doing all those things, people start doing calculations, right? How much this will cost? And then we have to, people maybe don't know, but the state of São Paulo supports these universities through taxes, and they invest about 8% of the whole budget in higher education and 25% of the budget in basic education. It's the only state in Brazil that has that amount for higher education. The next state invests about 2% of the state budget in higher education. So São Paulo has this commitment. So I think and Unicamp, you mentioned rankings, is always among the 2-3 top in Latin America, and it was 30 in the 50 best under 50 years old, whatever. And it has this role of an example. And it took a long time for these issues of violating the Republic principle of entrance exams. And let us remember that An entrance exam was, I think, first used, I think the Chinese used something like that for their structure, but France, when they used to do this École Polytechnique, Gaspard Monge, mathematician, went to every small city in France, and they developed an exam in Latin and mathematics. Well, elitist education required for that, but it was not anymore based on aristocracy, family, or direct economic power or political power. So it was for a long time an important thing, and if it was fair in the sense that it was not people going around it with money and buying places, it was a republic actual positive thing. But 200 years later, we look at it, and it's not really a proper way to accommodate and to develop a more equitable situation. So I think this is very important. And well, I thank Jamil for inviting me also here. And I'd like to thank the people at Unicamp, Ana Maria Carneiro, who's in charge of following up the students in lots of data. So you have a lot of data. We have published the paper, and there's another coming out, and they are developing reports on, so it's important to have data on this. And I think the role of a university like Unicamp in the context of Brazil is very important, because when Brazil was deciding if affirmative action based on race was constitutional, Unicamp was called, and I went to the Supreme Court in a hearing to tell the story, and it was, I think, relevant that the Unicamp had developed and was supporting such programs. And so it's both ways. It costs, you have to divert money to that, and people will say, well, maybe it will cost some research funds and so on. So Unicamp now, if you take salaries out, about 15% of the budget of Unicamp go to support students that have needs, which is a lot of money, actually. It's like $40 million, whatever. So, it's complicated. It's a big political fight. It took 20 years to get this through, and but you have to start. Sometimes when we started the first program, people say, this is not doing anything. So, yes, but if this works, people start saying it's not so complicated, maybe it's a good idea, and then next time you do a little more, next time you do a little more, and then it spreads out, and that's it.
Go ahead, Manal, you wanted to go. Oh, either way, I know you both were looking at, so go ahead. Go ahead, Carla.
Bueno, nosotros
Well, we've had the experience, in the case of universities, of having a very low cost per student. We could discuss this. The social reward or the social impact of this in certain parts of society, the more disadvantaged parts of society, really actually made it, gave it more bang for the buck. Once the state took over in this parallel program, supporting a student in the top 10 or top 15 with high social reward effects has a very low cost. And that's why it's been replicated throughout institutions. It's spread quite fast. The program emerged at the University of Santiago, and shortly after there were 16 institutions involved. And once again, this takes us back to the social role of higher education institutions. So, and then there's also the intersectionality. I mean, it's one thing to be supporting a woman with perhaps a disability and so on and so forth. You know, if you add on different exclusion factors, things can become a bit more complex, obviously. But there are some indicators. A year ago, the director for budgets in Chile assessed the program, and we have an official report looking at outcomes. So you've got the figures on how many obtained the degree, how many completed, okay, 7,000 students, how many of them actually complete the degree? Well, according to this report, and this is an available report, it's publicly available, the impact of this on education, on equality, and on opportunities for students entering institutions of higher learning is so high and so good that it offsets the cost. And that's why there is an attempt to continue to replicate this and expand on it. I'm just going to very briefly tell you about the Explora program. The program was for top 10% students. But we do realize that not all students are top 10% in all subjects. And there were some students who had very salient scientific talent. So instead of setting aside a quota for students with a very high scientific talent, well, we ended up with more than 28 institutions and more than 500 spaces set aside, places rather. Once this approach to diversification of access becomes more widespread, just the possibilities become more widespread too, because the outcomes are spectacular.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. Great questions. So I'm gonna address data, finance, and then rankings. So Jamil, thanks for bringing that up. Brilliant. Refugee higher education enrollment data is very, very difficult to collect accurately. So, I mean, as you all know, being in the field, higher education is immensely decentralized from the get-go. And then almost never do we see examples of where enrollment data is disaggregated by migratory status or legal status. So there are several countries that are collecting that data and can say, we have this number of recognized refugees in our higher education system. It's extremely rare. So the way we are collecting data, to be quite frank with you, is extremely ad hoc. And looking at a range of sources, from our scholarship program to standalone bespoke scholarship programs to individual institutions that are able to collect. But as you can imagine, collecting that kind of data is really sensitive. And so we can't actually advocate that that enrollment data based on or disaggregated by status is collected. It's just not responsible to actually say that. So, we say that we're at 5%. I would guess that we're at more like 7 or 8% of refugee youth enrolled, but I have no way, to be honest, of knowing. So this is a big project for us, and one that we're actually really eager to find experts in the field who will work with us on this challenge so that we can move to a more reliable, more robust way of collecting and reflecting on refugee enrollment. So please come and talk to me if you have an idea. The second piece on finance, again, super, super tricky. What I can say is, for example, our scholarship program, the average, so across all 55 countries, the average annual cost is incredibly cheap. It's $3,200 US per year per person. This is not a lot of money. But raising that money is incredibly expensive. So, for example, right now our primary donor is the government of Germany. And they come every year with a huge portion of the total amount of our scholarship program cost. And we are looking for additional state donors who will come on, at a really high level, so that it's not a question of raising money for 1 or 2 or 3 new scholarship places, right? We're talking about large numbers, high need, extremely low cost. But it's, I think that what's most persuasive, really, is the cost of not doing it, right? So if we look at the cost to host countries of not educating and then having these huge populations of displaced people on your books who can't work and don't have the skills even if they are allowed to work, this is where the real cost is, right? So this is, and then again, we also have great data, including from the bank, about the benefits of higher education for extremely disadvantaged groups, so women, first and foremost women, right? Those last years of investment in education are the biggest payoff. That's where the biggest payoff is if you get through secondary education, you get into tertiary, and then you actually get that diploma in your hand. That's where we see the payoff in terms of development goals, in terms of infinite maternal mortality rates, in terms of health, etc. It just goes on and on. This is the real cost is of not investing, not making these investments. And then finally to rankings. Currently, Times Higher Education is one of my favorite institutions on the planet, specifically because of the social impact rankings. So I think the fact that they have gone down this road of trying to incentivize and motivate universities by allowing them to shine a light on what they are doing in these areas right across the 17 SDGs, of which I will point to number 10 is on inclusivity. And so this is where we're looking for universities to be able to report and to be pressurized to report on how inclusive they are. And Times Higher Ed, I have to give credit, has come to us, and we have been working very closely with them to include language on forcibly displaced populations specifically. So you will begin to see that language come through. And each year, Times is revising their methodology, and each year we're putting in a little bit of a stronger focus and a sharper light on inclusion of forcibly displaced populations. And I'm hoping that it is an inducement, that it is an effective incentive for universities to get involved and then to reflect on the contributions that they're making. But I want to say, as far as I remember, I think last year only 1,300 institutions reported on the social impact rankings. So where you've got 15,000 or however many ranked, it is voluntary for them to submit data on the social impact rankings, and not many are doing it yet. So what we're hoping for, again, is that pressure builds, and including pressure from students, right? The students are the ones who are demanding diverse, rich campus environments that are inclusive of all different kinds of intersectionalities and of viewpoints, et cetera. And so I think students also have a big role to play in asking their institutions to report on the social impact rankings. But again, I think it's one of the most promising things that I've seen in terms of really creating that incentive for universities to get involved in this way, because, as you all know, the revenue from international students is what's powering a lot of universities. And while refugees are technically international students, they're not paying those high fees. And so it is at a cost often that institutions are including refugee populations. But we're hoping, again, that this is something of a payoff for them to do that.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Okay, we can take one more question, and then I'm going to wrap up. So actually, there are 3 questions. Can you ask your question in like 30 seconds, and then we can take all 3? Okay, so Jonathan, and then Professor, and then over there. Okay, go ahead. Whoever's here is going to ask a question. Pick.
Okay, thank you very much. So a lot of very inspiring institutional experiences, many initiatives, but the question remains a little bit how to move this to a bigger and a more systemic level. I think that is the question that we are fighting with, I think, for quite a number of years. And so I think the importance actually of policy, national policies, I think is really important. I think this is also what came out from some of the presentations, and I think also in our discussions really the crucial issue of funding to higher education institutions, because I think that's what you have said as well. It comes with a cost to welcome and follow up on students who are on the campus, who need special support, who need special guidance, who need mentoring to succeed. So we want to have our students having access, but we want them to succeed as well. So, and maybe the issue of funding policies for that to the higher education sector, so that, I mean, there is not only a policy, but there is also attached funding for higher education institutions who receive equity groups on the campus, acknowledging that the cost it takes. So I think it's really, I mean, pushing it a little bit further and bringing it really to a more systemic level, I think, and how we can do this. So this is my comment and my question.
Thank you. Yeah. Did you have a question? You can go ahead, throw it in. Yeah. It's okay. Just talk fast.
Okay, I'm going to talk fast. I thought of 2 things, but I'll
not
focus on one.
Not too fast for the translators, because they'll hate me. So,
Fast, but not too fast. I think I'll just, the one question I wanted to focus on was with regards to your program at Unicamp. There's a lot of, I haven't looked at this in a while, but there's a lot of history around foundation programs, like adding 1 or 2 years to help students adapt. There's a lot of history of those programs being very, very ineffective. And I imagine that depends a lot on how well they're delivered to some extent. But I'm interested in that experience and how much your students were like, well, I want to go to your university, but I don't have to do 2 extra years to be able to get the degree that the other students are getting in 3 years or something. So yeah, I'm interested in your reflection on that.
Okay, super. Very good. Then over to you. Go ahead. Over here. We'll take them all because we only have about 5 minutes left, so we'll take all the questions now. No, you were going to ask a question too. Yes, yeah, go ahead. Yes.
Oh, hi. I'm Anush Terjanian, and I'm wearing many hats today, but this is a question from my hat. I sit on the Governing Council of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And I'm so glad Manal made the point to the question about data collection. I would even push it to say it would be very interesting and important for someone to develop, a macroeconomist or otherwise, to develop figures on the cost of inaction, right? Because let's remember that universities are public assets across the world. And one of the barriers to inaction often is the governance, cultures, and structures of universities, of medieval institutions. So we know that diversity is a fact. This is, but that inclusion is a choice, right? And equity is a choice. So how do we ensure that this choice is acted upon? And I think one of the challenges we're faced is there are a lot of gatekeepers to democratizing the governance, culture, and structure of universities. And democratic governance yields transparency, it yields accountability, and it yields multiplication of inputs for more sustainable decision making.
I'm sorry, you have to be really fast, okay?
Very
because
fast.
The translators do need to leave, and so I'm being very aware of their own needs.
Don't worry.
Okay.
Egli Chacon from the International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. I did want to talk about the discussion of merit to put down some barriers related with access into higher education. Claudia, you talk about a program that it relates to try to overcome the merit barriers. So any one of you would comment of the merit discussion at the systemic level. Thank you.
Super. Okay, I am going to ask, can you speak in 30 seconds, the answer? Okay, so you take one, then Manal take the question that was directed towards you, and then maybe the two of you can talk about sort of more meritocratic interventions on your campuses. Go. Yeah.
When we talk to the campus about this, that was the first question. Who wants to come here, stay 2 years, and then another 4 or 5 years to graduate? We look at the data, and 60% of the students took more than 2 years to go from high school to being admitted, because they can take the entrance exam as many times as they want. And that was the story. And if you look at the people coming from public schools, it was more like 3 years. So that was actually, they were already in the school, on college, and they are getting the education that would help them later, not preparing for an exam that mostly didn't have anything with their further. And I'd like to finish with this. Derek Bock, who wrote with William Bowen, The Shape of the River. Everybody should read this book. He had this wonderful phrase: if you think that education is too costly, you should try the cost of ignorance.
Yes. Manal, you go ahead.
Derek Bock.
No, thanks. Anush, I'm sure that I can't
answer sufficiently. But the point is, I think the most important point is that from UNHCR point of view, we are at the beginning of our understanding and our implementation of a true inclusion strategy, right? It's only recently that we've made this shift and recognized that we actually live closer to the world of international development than to strictly humanitarian response, right? And so this is where partnership with Roberta and everything that we're doing together and benefiting from the bank is core. Because as you said, higher education is a public resource, or at least the institutions, and we should be able to understand and articulate and make the argumentation around inclusion and all the data pieces and the finance pieces that go with it better than we can. But we're right at the beginning, and so we're going to rely on the literature to build up and the theory to be further unpacked so that we can understand better what our actual arguments are. I mean, we're right at the start here, and so there's just loads of work to be done, but it's super interesting, right? So I think it's gonna get done.
Super. Carla, go ahead.
Yo respecto al mérito, decirte que
As to the merit, well, for us, any student who makes the most of their learning opportunities in their setting, whether it's a high setting or a low setting, is the student we seek out. I mean, some students will have a particular aptitude for a particular discipline. Higher education institutions need to find the way to rescue that talent, whether it's art, science, music, whatever. And sometimes this emerges, well, not at the end of secondary schooling, it emerges later on in life. There's some experience in Argentina with programs for people older than 25. Sometimes you have people with particular talent, but in any case, what we recognize is anybody who made the most of the opportunities available within their setting.
To the translation.
I was still going.
No, I would just like to make just a generic statement that, someone in the audience also made this, that education is for public good. So when we talk about inclusivity and we talk about equity promotion at the institution level, I think the larger picture is how do you include, for example, in our university, it's African students. We also include a lot of socially backward students, Indian students, which is not a compulsion on private universities, but we do that. So I think it's also to teach your own students who don't come from that background a lot more. So when we look at foreign students in a classroom, it's not about how good the foreign student will get benefited with, but it's also about how Indian students get benefited with having these students within. So you have to really look at the larger picture of inclusivity, that it doesn't benefit only those to whom you're providing that education because they're less fortunate, but you're making the others also understand the lessons of life, and then later on probably do something more. And we've seen this. Our studies have definitely shown that while the university offers scholarships, there are Indian students who pass out later, become our alumni, maybe work in Africa, and then want to fund a student back.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you to my panelists for this great conversation. I hope you leave here today with stronger advocates for equity in higher education than you came in. And please find the panelists if you have follow-up questions. I'm sorry we don't have more time. So thank you very, very much.